imagine a world where, a good SBC would be doing things like organizing an underground railroad for parents in California and Minnesota, in Washington, where kids can get trans without their consent. They would be doing aggressive cultural moves. Their Lifeway would be, hopefully like partnering with states in the planting of Christian schools and designing the curriculum for them. The Supreme Court laws now allow state funding to go to religious schools with voucher programs and doing stuff at scale that's going to matter culturally for hundreds of years.
This is not a business where you take polls. It's a business where you think. You're not right or wrong because 1,000 people agree with you.
Josh, man, good to have you on the pod, man.
It's great to be here.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah.
So you are at New Founding, but people know you by business on Twitter. They know you're involved in
New Founding. Business. I was I did a useless master's degree before I went to law school in Byzantine history, and I was also really into investing at the time. So I was also 22. People ask me why I got that handle while I was young and immature. So yeah, BYZNESS. It was sort of a mixture between Byzantine and business.
I think it's a cool.
Amazing.
I think it's a great handle. It just rolls up the tongue.
It's a distinctive handle.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think it worked great. So, but you're a New Founding, but that's not what we're here to talk about. The other thing you do is lead the American Reformer publication as the executive director, and most recently you were down at the Southern Baptist Convention doing a lot of work down there. So I think an interesting part about this podcast, why we started it, is a lot of people, New Founding overlaps with lots of different circles. You get tech guys listening to this, you get pastors listening to this, you get crypto bros listening to this. So for those who are not familiar with the SBC and that work, why don't you give us a quick intro and we dig into why you're focusing so much of your effort on this front.
Yeah. So the Southern Baptist Convention was founded in 1845. It's the largest Protestant denomination in America. It's a mainline denomination of sorts. It's comparable to the United Methodists and these other major denominations, the PCUSA, these other mainlines that you've heard of. But alone out of all of those, the Southern Baptist Convention has remained Orthodox Christian. They believe in these distinctives like the inerrancy of Scripture and traditional Christian sexual morality and of course like all the doctrines that are in the basic creeds of the Christian faith, right? And that really happened because in the 1970s and the early 80s, when these other mainline denominations were falling to modern liberalism, the Southern Baptist Convention had what's called the conservative resurgence. It was a populist uprising. At its high point, at the annual meeting of the convention, 50,000 pastors were flocking in from all over the country to right the ship. And that resulted in conservative takeovers of the major Baptist institutions like the seminaries. So you've heard of Al Mohler. He kind of came to the presidency of Southern Seminary at that time, purged the faculty of a bunch of lefties and sort of turned the institution into a generally faithful center of intellectual production for faithful churches. The Southern Baptist Convention just has a scale that makes it incredibly important. Like it's the largest, as already said, largest Protestant denomination. Its seminaries train somewhere between 25 and 30% of all the pastors in the country. Mm-hmm. So, the what they're learning in those seminaries then gets disseminated to, all kinds of obscure corners of the country. But all of this scale has made it it's made it a source of political fights. I mean, the left is extremely interested in the Southern Baptist Convention. They're extremely interested in neutralizing it as an effective force to their agenda. This is starting to get reported out, but well-resourced foundations and philanthropists like George Soros, literally, have been giving money that gets laundered one way or another into the convention, moving their leaders sort of off mission, getting them to be more consumed with things like immigration reform or what they euphemistically call creation care, which is actually just a sort of a way to entice Christians to get into environmentalism. Like these are very intentional campaigns to destroy the Southern Baptist Convention as a effective public voice and force for traditionalism in the public square. So, and then we have much of our struggle, I think, in the convention is actually just its leadership. It's a relatively parochial club of people who rise up through the ranks in the convention, and if you're somebody who Russell Moore is the perfect example of this. He's been trained, his whole life has been spent at Baptist academic institutions. He rises to the top of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. This is our think tank in DC. And once he gets there, he finds out, okay, I could represent my constituency in the public square, or I could critique my constituency in the public square. And if I critique them, I can get on MSNBC, CNN, I can get all sorts of sinecures. And so that's what he starts to do, and it had a poisonous effect. I mean, ultimately, he left under some scandal and agitation, and he immediately landed in like a University of Chicago lectureship, and he was doing a podcast,
taking advantage of that patronage network. That once you're in, you can.
They had his back,
right?
And he was doing a podcast with David Axelrod, the longtime Obama advisor. And those are, I mean, that speaks to his commitments, but it also speaks to, the effects that this has on individuals. And so, Russell Moore, again, I said he's the chief example, but this happens all the time. Baptists who in theory are conservative rise through the ranks, and then when they achieve a certain scale and platform by virtue of their leadership within the Baptist world, they find that there's all sorts of opportunities that are given to them by people who are outside of the convention and very much do not have the convention's best interests at heart.
Mm-hmm. So Meg, I think, it was Meg Basham wrote a great piece just on this particular topic as it relates to Russell Moore and other evangelical leaders that were co-opted during COVID to sell COVID doomerism to the church, essentially through because they see them as strategic. So how is the left so cued into how strategic these guys are? How are they just good at observing, or what makes them want to go after these guys in particular? Is it?
Yeah, I mean, the left, the right, a lot of their philanthropy is given to their churches. It's given in a way where people assume the best, so you give, most of us probably tithe to our church, right? 10% of my disposable income goes to my church. That's the mindset we tend to have. And when we do that, we're not, we have relatively loose hands with it. We're like, hey, we feel like that's our duty to do, and it's up to God and the faithful and God's faithful representatives to spend that prudently. The left is very hard-nosed and tactical about where their money goes, especially some of the big philanthropists, and they absolutely care and are very cognizant of the effects that their funding can have on Christian institutions, and even to Basham's reporting on those prominent. The way this works, you have a foundation that focuses on COVID. You find ambassadors within the Christian world who can get on board with your message, and you make a grant to them, and then they may then subsequently turn around and make grants to other Christian institutions that they can get on board. But you kind of have to get an ambassador to do it. And leaders will find, it's often through grant money, but they will often find there is funding available once they get to the top for adopting these outside agenda items. So
it seems surprising to me just from the outside. I've never been involved with the SBC, but it's surprised me that a denomination or a group that large hasn't already gone left a long time ago. Like with every other mainline denomination, you said there was sort of a resurgence. What do you think? Why do you think that is, that the SBC is still relatively on track, even when everyone else is not?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it's, I think there's a good contrarian spirit amongst Baptists. The core of the Southern Baptist Church is in the South, oftentimes in rural areas. It's much more of a working class church, and primarily rural white working class. These are people oftentimes who've lived out in the country for 5, 6, 7 generations. Farming, blue collar jobs. They've always had some resistance to the city. They've had resistance to major centers of cultural influence. And they've had an attitude of, I think, a very healthy attitude in a lot of ways of just, I've got my church, I've got the Bible. I don't need a seminary degree to know what God wants me to do. And you know what? That's basically right.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. So maybe they have, maybe in some, obscure hollers of Appalachia, people have cooked up some odd theological theories here and there. But you know what? They can still read the Bible and like figure out what it tells. They can figure out from the Bible that there's men and women and that those are different, and the basic strokes of how God wants us to live. And
they're almost like inherently skeptical of anybody that comes out with a fine suit and a bunch of credentials, PhD,
absolutely.
that says, oh no,
Absolutely.
Back in Europe they tell you that it's actually different. Like,
and the mainline churches, these were often in cities and more well-resourced areas, and so as mainstream society starts to take a leftward turn, they sort of, without a lot of examination, sort of turn with it. So I think that's a big part of the reason. But it's extremely conservative. The people in the pews in the SBC, I think they went 95% for Trump in 2020. So it's a very, and that's 13 million people, very, what could be a very effective unit of people for political action and all these other things in the SBC.
Yeah.
So.
How does and we'll get to the convention that you were present at a couple of weeks ago, but leading up to that, can you talk a little bit about the SBC polity, like how it's structured, hierarchy? Again, people may be familiar with Roman Catholic Church and Presbyterian, but what's the polity look like? The structure, the organizing structure of the SBC like?
So it's it's like a representative republic. The cornerstone of Baptist belief about the church is that each individual local church is autonomous. Like they're ruled by pastors or elders, and those pastors or elders are directly responsible to God, and then they're also congregationalists. So they're led by these representatives, but then major decisions are subject to the vote of the congregation, the members of that church. And this ties into other aspects of Baptist belief, like the main distinctive, right, is that Baptists baptize people who've reached an age of maturity who can confess that they've confessed faith in Christ, and then undergo baptism as a volitional act. And so the Baptist ideal is that, of course, this isn't perfect, but you're aiming in your church to have what we call a regenerate church membership. Every person who's been baptized and is a member of the church, our ideal is that each one of them would be regenerate. And that's important when the congregation is voting on material things, right? So that's sort of the bedrock, okay? And then you say, well, why is there a massive Southern Baptist Convention? What's the point of that? Well, in Baptist thought, like that's about pooling resources for effective collective action. It's a creature of prudence. I mean, there's no scriptural mandate to be a part of any convention. You could totally do it on your own if you wanted to, but for prudential reasons, it might be good to be part of a large network. So the Southern Baptist Convention is essentially a voluntary association. Churches can raise their hand and send money to it and say, I would like to join. And when they do so, they do have to say that they agree with the Baptist faith and message. It's a relatively short document, much shorter than the Westminster Confession or the Catholic, is it the Catechism? Like it's much more concise, and it covers the basics. So there's currently 47,000 churches that have done that in the Southern Baptist Convention.
What are the benefits that are conferred to a church if they join the network?
Yeah, it's like reduced tuition at seminaries. It's much easier to support missionaries, like on a sort of partial basis. Like you can rather than sending your own, you pitch in to send missionaries all over the world. It also has some of that church infrastructure stuff that can be helpful. Like, you need insurance and a retirement plan for your pastor, so you join for that reason. So those are some of the main benefits.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, leading up to the convention 2 weeks ago, the New York Times wrote about the outcome, and we'll put the article in the show notes. But talk about why this was particularly critical gathering and the things that were sort of at stake.
So the Southern Baptist Convention has always reserved the office of pastor to men. This comes from Scripture, I think the clear teaching of Scripture. And this has been the issue that, the mainline denominations turned what we call egalitarian 40, 50 years ago. And then subsequent to those decisions, bowed the knee on a number of other items to the sexual revolution and the moral revolution. The SBC was sort of a holdout on that, and has been a pretty strong holdout in a lot of ways. But the drift, when it comes to the SBC, it looks a little different and smells a little different, right? It's not. We've started having a little drift, and it's not like it doesn't come in the form of an erudite theologian, making arguments from philosophy or the text or something like that. It comes from megachurch pastors who feel social pressure to compromise and aren't even making totally logically coherent arguments.
They're not necessarily digging into the Greek and being like, the root of this word. And no. Yeah.
It's like guys like Rick Warren, right? And So like a year and a half ago, Saddleback started ordaining women pastors. And then just as a grassroots matter, other folks in the convention started to look around and they noticed, there's actually like a fair number of churches with women pastors in our convention. And so this was an issue last year in our convention in Anaheim. I'll gloss over all of the gory procedural details, but this was an issue last year. And then a motion was put underway in Anaheim that a pastor, Mike Law, a guy from Northern Virginia, has he ran a website and did issue awareness on this issue all year in lead up to the meeting of the convention in New Orleans. And the discussion was fascinating. We had a lot of moderates who would say, like, we hold to the old Baptist position on paper. But then they would say things like, this issue is insignificant, and really our major concern here is, how the women in our churches who want to go into ministry are hearing this controversy, right? So they would say they believe the right things on paper, but showed almost no urgency about or curiosity, is this a major problem in the convention? Mm-hmm. And then if so, no urgency about trying to be, faithful to God's word. So in the midst of that, American Reformer ran a number of pretty critical articles in the public debate. We ran a piece by Meg Basham that highlighted this controversy, and then also went into Rick Warren and Saddleback and some of the some of the broader stuff that's going on at Saddleback that you would expect to follow a church that caves on egalitarianism.
Can you just give us a little background on Saddleback and what's happened there in the last few years?
Yeah, so they started ordaining women pastors to pastor roles that were slightly below senior pastor level, but
so they're not the head pastor.
They're not the head pastor, but they're exercising functions that, you know, are pastoral in nature. And you know, look, I mean, we're not like Presbyterians, Baptists. Our church titles are totally ad hoc, you know, that like, you know, so that presents some difficulty. You know, we have ambiguity both in title conventions and then in function. And those are sort of two separate points, but you know, we want clarity on both, right? We want churches to only give out the title pastor to somebody who qualifies in Scripture for that role of pastor, elder, overseer, that shepherding function. That should only go to men as understood in Scripture. But then secondarily, like with respect to function, a church could have all the right title and naming conventions for its org chart, but be delegating shepherding like functions to people who are not qualified to be shepherds. And so we have both of those issues simultaneously. But with Saddleback, so they started this women's ordination practice. And then Rick Warren actually retired as senior pastor, and he was replaced by a husband-wife team who were co-pastors. And that's the current situation at Saddleback. And then alongside that, people should check out Meg Basham's story. It's Mr. Smith goes to the convention, but Saddleback has a lot of recent involvement with various organizations that are LGBT affirming. Yeah. So perhaps not a surprise, but these things are always co-travelers. But she brought the receipts, and it's a pretty jarring read.
And Rick Warren, I mean, for those unfamiliar listening to this, he's also the author of one of the best-selling books of all time.
Yeah,
the Purpose-Driven Life.
Purpose-Driven Life.
So he this is not like a small little church that is doing all these things, and you're like, well, why? You know, just kind of ignore them or push them out. They have an enormous following and have had for across generations.
And Rick Warren is interesting. I mean, he was one of the ones who got caught up in pushing COVID maximalism during that fiasco, and then he's been to Davos several times actually.
Really?
Yeah. So he's fascinating.
You're telling me for the first time.
What?
You're telling me for the first time.
He's indicative of a problem that evangelicalism has, particularly like lower church evangelicalism, which is just that you rise to prominence by being charismatic and building a big church and being a celebrity. And, you know, Rick is not an intellectual, right, or anything like that, but he's just a guy who's generally had a pretty like emotional and popularity driven ministry, and seems to have been recently totally just unequipped to deal with cultural pressure. And so when the world keeps telling him that he's being mean and he needs to change, he's not anchored to Scripture and the tradition that understands it. He's ready to float along, perhaps even without realizing it. And so it's interesting. I said earlier that drift looks different when it happens in the low church, and this is the example of it, right? It's relatively like, it's not reflective. It's relatively sort of unthinking drift. So we came up to the convention. Again, we had moderates, including some near leadership, saying this is not a problem. And on the eve of the convention, American Reformer ran an article that did a statistical analysis on women in the SBC. We ran it on Saturday evening. The convention was on Tuesday. The article concluded based on their sample that there were likely over 1,800 women pastors and over 1,200 churches in the SBC. This accorded with a number that actually Rick Warren has been saying on Twitter. He's been going around saying there are 1,928 churches with women pastors. And I don't know how he got that number, but he's got a lot of resources, and I wouldn't doubt that he had a research team that gave him that number. So
his point being that we've reached critical mass, so this is clearly something
like
people
don't
want.
cut off your arm. But this generated a ton of interest and discussion right on the eve of the convention. You said earlier, New York Times picked it up. I chatted with Ruth Graham from the New York Times on this, they talked about the debate, and so there we were. We were all at the convention. All of these issues had been aired, and here's the good thing about the convention, despite what I view as like a relatively feckless leadership class for the most part, the people in the convention are very good overall, especially when they get educated on the issue. And on this issue, because of this local pastor, Mike Law, he's been doing yeoman's work all year, just emailing pastors, going on podcasts, writing articles, running a website. People had been educated on that issue before they walked in the room, and they overwhelmingly voted the right way. So the vote to disfellowship Saddleback, this is the mega church that Rick Warren runs, it was like 90% to 10%, wow. Just resoundingly. And then even on the, Mike Law had proposed like an amendment that would just put in our Constitution a very bright line rule that a church that has any female pastor on their staff of any kind is not in close cooperation. This is needed for complex reasons, but it's a good solution, bright line rule. He needed 2/3 for that to pass, and it passed with somewhere between 75 to 80% of the room's support over the opposition of the moderates on the stage.
Amazing.
So it was a very heartening week for conservatives in the convention, and I think a lot of good stuff about that. But one of the best things was it was like illustrative of like how you need to win in these sorts of institutional battles. Like there's no shortcut. Like it is hard work. And on this issue in particular, this pastor and the team of volunteers who helped him, they worked tirelessly all year to educate on the issue. And that's what you need to do. You need to pick your handful of issues that you educate on and speak clearly, consistently, keep up the pressure all year and lead up to one of these meetings. You get the people in the pews educated, and then they're going to show up and vote the right way. Because, look, I mean, most of them, even though they have the right instincts and, and all of that, when you're in the room and the people on the stage are telling you something, if you're not deeply intimate with the issues, your inclination is going to be to defer. And so, but as already said, there's in general a crisis of confidence and courage from Baptist leadership. So this is looking forward. What I want and what I think a lot of conservatives in the SBC want is they actually want they want an SBC with much stronger, more proactive, healthy leadership that's dedicated to serving Christians in sort of tough cultural times right now. There's all sorts of dogs that aren't barking in terms of things that the convention could be doing that it's not. And one example, we have Lifeway, this is the largest publisher of Christian curriculum in the country, primarily focusing on Sunday school curriculum. And we're at a stage right now in our society where coming out of COVID, Christian classical schools and homeschooling has doubled, maybe tripled in the last 3 years. And the Southern Baptist publishing arm is nowhere to be seen in this entire conversation. They're not resourcing that group of people. Biggest Protestant denomination in the country. They, with the resources that they have, if they came to the front lines, they could be extremely effective at scale.
Why are they not? Is it just they don't see the strategic opportunity, or
it's weird. In 2021, the executive leadership of Lifeway came to the convention and asked for permission to take homeschooling and Christian schools out of their mission statement. They said, yeah, we're not really doing it. It's kind of a vestigial organ.
2021?
Yeah. Right in the heart of this, massive exodus to homeschooling and Christian schools. I said, yeah, it's a vestigial tale. We're not really seeing a lot of action on that front. And and the convention overwhelmingly told them, no, you need to be doing that. So I don't know. I think it's just a problem of personnel, and like that. Obviously, there's opportunity, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we all know there's opportunity, but for whatever reason, the leadership there has not grasped it. Or here's another example. We have the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. This is our think tank. They don't put in much time to fighting like really bad stuff, right? Like. The California law that just passed that, that allows the state to take your kids and trans them without parental consent. They were pretty quiet about that. Meanwhile, in Tennessee, they advocated with the governor to pass a red flag law around a firearms purchase, or they sometimes they oppose abortion bills that they view as too radical to their right, or historically, they've done a lot around immigration reform, advocating for amnesty and which are all of those issues are significantly out of step with where Southern Baptists are holistically. But even more fundamentally than that, they're distractions. Like this, again, 13 million people, you've got a think tank. You could be at the front lines of debates that really matter in the country, try to be an effective force for political fights where you've got the clear teaching of Scripture and Christian tradition and current Baptist interests all at your back. And they've been distracted by, I think, much more tendentious and controversial issues rather than sort of fighting the clear battles.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm really interested to dig into this, like how an institution like the SBC starts to drift leftward, because of what you said earlier, that it's different than, let's say, how an elite institution goes left. That one is sort of, we talk to a lot of guys here in the podcast and at the office who come from government or venture capital, or whatever, big corporations. And you can kind of see how that one happens. But in the SBC, it's interesting. You have a disconnect, or not disconnect, a distance between people in the pews who are just living their lives ordinary way. In many cases, you said they have the right instincts. They know going this direction is not where they should go. But there are a few key people who have bought into this, like almost the economy of image, where as soon as you start getting recognition and you start getting invitations to come to a dinner, or come to an event, or come speak at the whatever, they put it all on the line to be able to attend these things and sort of inadvertently drag, or for the people in the pews the people in the pews are inadvertently dragged into a direction they did not expect. They may not even be aware it's happening at the level of leadership. Where again, a corporation, even if you're the lowest employee, you're going to see a pride flag on the day you walk in. There's going to be a pride flag on your profile on LinkedIn, and then that the company invests according to ESG principles. In the SBC, you may be part of a church, and you don't know that at the broader level, there are all these sort of cosmic battles going on because you are just tithing and showing up for church every day and going along. Is that the perception that a lot of these, where a lot of the congregants at these smaller SBC churches surprised with the drift, with the direction of the convention?
Yeah. It was this year in New Orleans. Actually, there were two churches that were egalitarian that were kicked out, and I think a lot of the good, faithful people from rural Oklahoma or what have you, who scrimped and saved to send their pastor to New Orleans, I think they were shocked to hear people from the floor of the convention just calling for the SBC to be egalitarian. And that's part of the reflected in the vote and everything. I mean, it was kind of jaw dropping. And I think a lot of people have the sense of, we had these arguments 30 or 40 years ago. Why are we having them again? And the answer as to why we're having them again is compromised leaders. And they're leaders who would affirm the right things on paper, but heavily qualified. And then the tactics that they implement to try to like steer the convention in accordance with those, they're disastrous tactics. I think to your point, I think we need a lot more like prudent lay leadership and sort of lay influence in the convention. I think that the overall problem, it's not every single person, but the overall directional problem with the convention's current leadership is that they generally don't. They've generally risen to prominence just sort of through the ranks in Baptist institutions, been relatively sort of untested, right? Generally, these are not people who've like worked on Wall Street or went to like elite liberal schools. They never had like oh, wow, the emperor has no clothes moment, like maybe a lot of us have, right? So they still have this sort of like nascent desire for, I don't know, respectability or prestige that comes from a mainstream institution, sort of saying, oh, wow, you're not like other Baptists, you're thoughtful. That's like an instinct that it just needs to be totally broken in all Christian leaders. Like, it needs to be totally destroyed, because these mainstream institutions, like the New York Times or what have you, they're like extremely cognizant that they have that effect on Christian leaders. Yes. Like, they know that they have a carrot that they can offer that will incentivize certain behaviors from Christian leaders. And so like, we need people who rise to those positions who are like 100% immune from that. And I think one way you get that is like get faithful brothers into leadership who have had their stints, in those sorts of places. My good friend John Whitehead, he's a Harvard lawyer. He just represented a case up to the Supreme Court, fighting for Christian schools in his home state, Missouri. And this guy put his hat in the ring for to be the president of the executive committee, a big function. They had a search going on. And this is at a time when the SBC has a lot of like litigation, and like, who better than somebody who's like a Harvard lawyer who's represented Baptist associations for 20 years, but he's an outspoken conservative. And he ultimately got passed over for much more mediocre candidates who've kind of are going to vote the right way and have the right tone in the eyes of other leadership. But this is the sort of thing. The leaders are, it's a bit like a union where, you've gone through the Baptist ranks and all of the Baptist institutions, and you have sort of a certain winsome tone, and then you're sort of part of the club and you can rise through the ranks. And this whole system actually is very sort of hostile and unwelcoming to extremely competent, faithful people coming from the outside. So we need to reform that.
Yeah. How much of this is due to Baptist historic tradition? And by this, I specifically mean, a lot of these people may just, all of us, if we really could, we just want to raise our kids, live our lives, build our businesses. And now we're being thrust into a cosmopolitan level insanity where you can't even just live your life in, the hills of, the Cumberland River in Tennessee. You have to be thinking about what the Davos folks are going to be pushing down your throat next. And is there kind of a, I'm Presbyterian, so I'm not as familiar with the Baptist instinct, but is there a Baptist instinct that says like, that is intentional? Is there something in the historic tradition of the Baptists that makes them less ready to engage in the broader cultural wars as a whole, or is this something?
There didn't used to be.
Okay.
Yeah. So Baptists have been, in the 1920s, when some states started to liberalize their blue laws, the SBC put out a resolution calling for stores to be closed on Sunday and all of this, right? And there's many different examples like that we could talk about, but they used to be a lot more public-minded. Russell Moore and a handful of others in the 90s and the early 2000s really started to develop what I kind of view as like a psyop about this really maximalist view of Baptist political theology. The Baptist political theology and cultural engagement sort of requires, basically it requires you to be like, a Rawlsian.
Docile.
Yeah. Like believe in, and this was all, I say it was an op, like it's all kind of fake, right? Like yes, like some of the early Baptists, they valued religious liberty. They were not the established religion. They found themselves sometimes in positions where they were being persecuted for their beliefs. And so some of them did write a lot about the importance of religious liberty, but they were still doing so in the context of a society that was, had generally Christian norms on a broad level, and totally different ballgame than kind of the maximalist pluralist stance of the late 20th century. And so, a lot of what American Reformer wants to do, and it's with all Protestantism, but you see this most clearly with Baptists, is sort of push back on what we view as like late 20th century co-opting of Christian political theology, right? Like we can legislate morality. In fact, every single law is legislating morality. We don't leave our faith at the door when we enter the public square. And if our religion isn't being upheld in the public square, there will be another religion being upheld in the public square.
Or McIntyre's great at this, the myth of the secular state.
Yeah. No, that was all, the myth of the secular state was a Trojan horse to displace Christianity and make room for a successor religion, which at least right now, I'd say the leading horse is the rainbow religion.
Yes.
I mean, So, this is what we want to accomplish. And look, it's not particular to Baptists. Presbyterians have their own versions of it, coming from a lot of different theological camps. Mm-hmm. People can find a way to rationalize themselves into complacency with the status quo, and whatever theological answer allows you to not be confrontational. I'm a Baptist, so I'm probably particularly attuned to those issues, but in the Presbyterian Church in America, we see similar dynamics expressed a little bit differently vocabulary. This is overall the project of American Reformer through our journal, and then through the campaign work that we do, right? It's sort of pushing Christian leaders to be good leaders for their people, to help them think rightly about politics, because politics is intruding into everything right now. It's not, being apolitical as a pastor is not an option. You will have to speak to pressing issues that matter to your flock.
Yeah, and your institution will be a target of the left, whether you're a shop that bakes cakes, or a large Protestant institution or denomination, or a company that sells software. They're coming for you. They're going to be knocking on your door to make you think and align with a particular set of values. On that note, so talk a little bit about the work that American Reformer does to help institutions stay faithful. Some of it is obviously what you just described at the SBC, but more broadly, a lot of this, is educating people, helping them stay aware of the issues. But then once change has happened, is helping an institution stay faithful. So what is American Reformer doing on that front?
Yeah. So we have what we call our reform work, and this is basically me and volunteers and friends who share a aligned, united vision for how Christian leaderships need to be operating in the 21st century. And we consult, we advise, we connect, we do coalition building. Sometimes even at the SBC this year, sometimes for the conservatives to win, there need to be strange bedfellows. There need to be, conservatives are very precise about lots of minor things, and they have arguments, and because they care.
And they're fun.
And they can be very fun, but sometimes you need to do some coalition building to get over that and accomplish some common goals. So we do all that sort of thing, and we do it with denominations. We do it with like any other Christian institution, right? Like Christian colleges. There's 200 or 300 really conservative Christian colleges around the country. Similar problems exist there, right? Like academics, most of them go to a mainstream academic institution. I'd say the exception is the one who's really bold and convicted about their faith and very proactively critiques their discipline from the perspective of their faith. But the norm is somebody who's maybe a little bit embarrassed or a little bit uncertain, and is kind of holding their faith in tension with their academic field. And they maybe even feel some insecurity. They want to go to the mainstream academic conference. And like, if you go there, they're going to think, oh man, okay, he's not really a scholar. He's at a Christian school. Like, is he really even legit? And, you've always got this chip on your shoulder. You're trying to prove I'm not like those other Christians. I can, I don't have their biases. I'm actually pretty smart. And, you would be surprised. I actually agree with you on a lot. So the socialization of academic leadership in Christian schools is something that needs to be thought through and addressed. And so we've done some, at Grove City College, this is a prominent conservative Christian college that it used to be sort of mentioned in the same sentence as Hillsdale, right? You got Hillsdale or Grove City, which one, like Harvard or Yale, Hillsdale and Grove City. And it's been struggling. It had a woke incursion after the summer of 2020. And there was a grassroots organization of parents that was agitating, and they weren't getting really far. So we got involved with them, cast a spotlight, kind of instituted or helped instigate a media and social media blitz to create awareness on the issue. And it ultimately culminated in their board of directors doing an investigation saying, oh yes, there was a woke incursion here, and we need to fix it. And here's the steps that the institution will take to fix it. So that was really good. And then there's a lot we do in the background, just sort of consulting and connecting. If you're a pastor or anybody in any stakeholder of a Christian institution, and you've got a story that you think needs to be highlighted, like we'll find a way to highlight that in American Reformer, or put you in touch with people who can highlight it elsewhere. So that's sort of generally the work that we do, and we're building coalitions of, I think, friends, and also friends who have a common project across denominational lines. So we've got Presbyterians and Baptists and Anglicans and Charismatics who are all seeing similar issues in their own groups and working towards a collective goal without sacrificing their theological distinctives. So,
how do you see the broader landscape, for that particular issue in the SBC? Very encouraging. I wouldn't have thought that those type of battles would be being won at that level right now. Do you think that's symptomatic of a broader shift? What do you think the future looks like?
Yeah, I mean, I think the SBC tends to run a little bit behind. But they're just, the SBC floats along pretty impervious to a lot of, I'm talking about the actual rank and file in the pews. Yeah. They've just been relatively immune from a lot of stuff. Their leadership gets tossed to and fro, but the people in the pews are they're like a solid as a rock, generally speaking. More broadly, I saw this in coverage on the Presbyterian General Assembly that just happened too. Really good stuff happening there. I think there is a younger generation of leaders that's coming up that is a lot more savvy to what it takes for Christian institutions to thrive right now. Maybe you could say in Aaron Wren's Three Worlds framework, they know that we're a negative world. But you guys have probably seen this, like somebody who's in their, mid 30s, who spent some time in mainstream institutions and has remained a conservative Christian. We just know we're just more savvy, I think, to the pressures and what it takes to operate in this world. What is that Batman quote? Like I was born in the darkness and you're just visiting, right?
Yeah.
Like we were all born in the darkness, and a lot of our generation is more liberal on average, but those of us who have remained conservative are, somewhere to the right of Attila the Hun, I think. Yeah. So,
Josh Steinman, whom we had on the podcast recently, he was in a different conversation was saying how he worked at the Pentagon and wanted to increase their cycle of innovation. They're a slow-moving organization. Obviously they're heavy. it's hard to move the Pentagon quickly in terms of innovation. He said that the Pentagon changes at the rate of decay. So as older guys leave or retire or die, newer guys come on board and they understand the time we're on. Maybe they have experience in more fast-paced environments where the older generations just didn't. I think, we're seeing that a lot. Even just guys that I talk to and we talk to here who, in many cases, are pastors who are just on Twitter. Like they're just kind of watching from the sidelines. They're not necessarily interacting and engaging and jumping in on threads and things like that, but they have their feelers out there to see like what's going on broadly. What are the issues broadly? Where are things moving culturally? And they can take that information back to their local church or their local guys in ways that, a pastor who is 60 may just not even have it may not even cross his mind to say, what's this twitter.com that I'm going to fire up and kind of plug into. It's interesting to just see how Twitter, social media, but Twitter specifically helps has a lot of things that may not help, but it does help for some of these guys to just stay in touch with what's going on.
It does. And whether conservatives lean into it and use it or not, liberals do, and have been using it for years. A lot of Antifa, rapid response to events, being able to show power on the streets quickly, all of that's all social media driven. If you recall the some of the color revolutions, actually, the color revolutions in Eastern Europe or the Arab Spring.
Yeah,
it's got a ton of press, for being sort of the first social media driven revolutions, basically. And I think going forward, effective institutional leadership will necessarily include savvy social media use.
And I think also, maybe I'm curious about your thoughts on this, but also potentially in a good way, that can help, done right. It can help keep the leadership, even at a local level, the pastor, let's say, in line or in check, if the congregants themselves are more aware of what's going on culturally, because they themselves are, let's say, on Twitter or listening to podcasts or getting red pilled, as it were. And if their pastor, if half the guys in a congregation are listening to or reading American Reformer and on Twitter and reading particular books, and their pastor is seemingly unaware of things that are happening, that can, in a good way, just at a local congregational level dynamics, help the pastor stay in check. The guys, the congregants themselves can be like, hey, are you aware that these things are going on from just checking Twitter or listening to a podcast?
And a lot of more pastors than
you've run into people who are like, oh, I read American Reformer, and they're just rank and file congregants.
No, totally. And it's American Reformer. I've been thinking about this a lot. I think most of our readers are 30s and 40s, white collar, who can't get that kind of content elsewhere, but they're people who care deeply about the church. They're people who generally they have kids and they're thinking about what kind of church is going to be around when my kids are grown up, and what does that do to our country? If the American church is destroyed, what's that do to the country overall? And this is something I want, to say the new founding audience, maybe some listening aren't Christians or not really plugged in, but even now, there is so much good, if you're going to talk about any place in the country where there's a residual of civic virtue and old America that's actually holding this country together and restraining evil, it's to be found in churches. And a lot of them are going to be low churches, like Baptist, Church of Christ, Charismatic, Pentecostal, in rural areas. And even, if you've read Charles Murray's Coming Apart, he talks about how in poor rural areas, these churches have these incredibly important social functions. People are, generally fentanyl's destroying our working class right now, but people who are churched are they're still having kids. They're going through the sort of the success sequence, right? Getting married, getting jobs, staying away generally from substance abuse. Churches are they've just been a bedrock for producing virtuous citizens in this country. And so it's kind of in everybody's interest to want to see these churches remain healthy and uncompromised. So yeah, that's
on that book. That's and what you just said. It's fascinating. Also, the interesting divide that's happening, rural versus suburban, and also the economic divide across these. So you have faithful congregants who hold to orthodoxy, who hold to tradition, who are in many cases the only people holding to tradition in a particular area, but they're poor. So they don't have a lot of influence in the public square. And then you have, the people with means, connections, power, etc., and have all the influence, but just, they throw tradition, they throw orthodoxy out the side.
Well, yeah. There's the social dynamics of this are really interesting. So just going back to Charles Murray's book, he has these two camps, right? He calls it Belmont and Fishtown. Belmont's the town where the cognitive elite live, and then Fishtown is where the lower classes live. And when Christians, well-meaning Christians who believe the right thing on paper, come to Belmont to be pastors, they're pastoring people who oftentimes are heavily socialized into, major blue city, cosmopolitan social mores. And even if those people still believe traditional things on paper, they're habituated into being quiet about it. They're habituated into sort of a sense of embarrassment about it. Like even just getting down to real brass tacks, like if you work at an elite private equity firm or an elite law firm in Manhattan, you probably can't join the board of like the Christian school that your kids go to. If your kids go to a Christian school that has traditional morality as part of its policy, that would create headline risk. I talked to somebody 2 weeks ago who was asked to be an elder at his church, which was just a basic Bible-believing church. He was at an elite law firm, and he said, "No, I can't do that. It would create headline risk." So when pastors go to Belmont, if they're ministering to people who are like plugged in members of Belmont, they're ministering to people who are going to have significant cultural pressure at a minimum to stay quiet about the Christian tradition. If not, really it's constant pressure to compromise. And a lot of them don't, but they stay in this sort of no man's land where they're kind of embarrassed about it and they don't talk about it, and they're not effective voices. And those pressures then influence the pastor. The pastor theoretically could be kind of prophetic because he's not working at Goldman Sachs. Like he's not worried about getting canceled, but he gets the headline risk sort of imputed by virtue of who's in his congregation. So like the major givers in his congregation, they don't want their pastor making a stink and being in the front of the New York Times because all their coworkers know they go there. Yeah. So, you go to that kooky culture warring church, don't you? So there's all these sort of hidden, subtle, like social effects that go on. And ultimately, this is partly why we need, given the left's cultural dominance of elite business institutions, this is part of why we need totally alternative status hierarchies. We need, I think more broadly, Christians need to start reevaluating why do we send 95% of our best and brightest to go work in relative anonymity and keep their heads down at Goldman Sachs for 30 years, where they can't be cultural leaders for the church. It takes them off the playing field. So,
truth bomb, Josh Abbotoy on the New Founding podcast. Yeah, that's true. And then I think what would you say to somebody who, let's say, a hypothetical guy who reads American Reformer, a young guy who's who wants to go into ministry and maybe wants to go minister in a place like New York City, or wants to go to Silicon Valley, plant a church in San Francisco or whatever. Like what would be your advice as somebody who's been both who understands the church dynamics and the denominational dynamics, but as somebody who's also worked at lead private equity law firms. What would be your advice to somebody who wants to go there as a mission field?
I would first try to talk them out of doing that, and merely because most of the major Christian denominations are over allocating resources to those cities already. So that I can't tell you how many churches are trying to be planted in those areas and failing because every church planter wants to plant a church in Manhattan or San Francisco or what have you. Meanwhile, across the Bible Belt, there are churches that still have congregations, like 50 people, that are dying because they can't find a pastor. So I would push anybody to interrogate the assumption that they should go plant a church in the city. But if they really tested that and they still felt that was their call, maybe they had roots there, maybe they had particular success. I mean, I would say go in cognizant about the socialization that your people are going to have, and view it as like, this is not like, it's more like going to a hostile foreign mission field in a lot of ways than like, going to just some random American city, right? Like it's a lot more dangerous
combat than it looks, right?
It's combat, yeah. Right. And like you have to have that mindset. Finally, I wrote an article about this, the Acts 29 ministry model, but like you need to know when it's like Christians of all stripes should go where the harvest is, right? You need to know when to shake the dust off your sandals. And I'm not saying that to say some absolute rule about like, just if you're in a city for 5 years and it's not working out, leave and never look back. But we need to have a little bit more of that than we do right now. Don't pull your punches and like quietly work there for 20 years, hoping, you can get a little crew together eventually. Like go in boldly, proclaim the gospel. And if it sticks, then stay and keep your church. And if it doesn't, like, go somewhere where there's a riper harvest.
What would you say to guys on the vocational side who are looking at going into like private equity or law or any of those typical fields and are thinking about like going into Goldman Sachs?
Well, I mean, this is something we talk about at New Founding a lot, right? We don't have the major institutions yet that can train people. I mean, there are some, I think New Founding's one of them. There's some others. There's a movement that's coming up of, I think really good, Christian-led organizations that offer an alternative to working at a place, not like Goldman, but private equity at least. But I don't think any of those places are going to be good places to like cut. If you want to be a stone cold killer at your profession, they're not going to be places where you're going to get the training that you need right now. So I would say if you want to do that, consider your stint at one of those places a tour of duty. Go for 3 or 4 years, keep it time limited, get the skills, and then get out. Because you're going to be, during your time there, you're going to be a non-combatant for the church. Like you'll be too busy for one thing, but you'll also just be incredibly subject to incredible pressure to not exercise any cultural leadership on behalf of the church. Maybe y'all experience this. I know I did, and a lot of people have. When you get into an organization like New Founding or something like that, when you've been in a more professional environment where you're not allowed to speak your mind, when you get here, it feels like a weight coming off your shoulders, and you can hold your head up and say what you believe. And the church needs a lot more men, a lot more ambitious, like high performers who get themselves into situations like we are now, who can speak their mind, and we can habituate persuasiveness. We can habituate like demonstrating the Christian way of life and how it's good for us as creatures and all of this, right? Like be a much clearer witness.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, Ben Merkel, president of New St. Andrews College, one of the, it's much smaller than Hillsdale and Grove City, but certainly one of the faithful Christian institutions. He was talking about recently at an event that I was at, talking about the guys that he talks to who go into Goldman Sachs, let's say, and they're like, oh, just a few more, one more year, and then I'm gonna get out, or one more year, and then I'll start speaking the truth. One more year of training, and who essentially don't do what you're saying. They don't time cap. They don't say I'm gonna be here for 3 and then leave and then start something on my own or join a smaller outfit, whatever. They just like one more, and their thinking is, in some cases sincere. Their thinking is, if I'm here for 20 years, then I'm gonna be, and if I grind my way to the top, then I'll get to be the advisor to the CEO, or like in a position of leadership where I can actually affect change from the top down and all this stuff. And in his experience, Ben Merkel talking about guys that he's met and interacted with who've thought this way. His experience, it never happens for a bunch of reasons, but primarily because the self-censoring becomes a habit over 20 years. I mean, whatever you do, that's what you are. And so self-censoring becomes a habit. And by the time you've reached, let's say you do reach the position where you could theoretically have the kind of levers to affect institutional change, there's so much to lose. There's so much to lose. And his other point was the network that you've built to get along the way is not a network that will catch you the moment that you are dethroned for saying the right things.
Oh no, it's a network that will sanction you.
They will immediately turn on you.
Yeah.
At places like New Founding, one of the things we want to build is like the alternative patronage network, where there's the revolving door of good people where we can take care of our guys, and at the same time enable men to speak boldly and clearly on cultural issues without having to create this sort of illusionary house of cards situation where at some point they'll affect change, but actually everything they've done subsidizes them not speaking boldly, not taking a courageous stand in a particular direction.
Well, you have to get very sophisticated if you're going to stick it out in an institution like that. You have to get very sophisticated about justifying and rationalizing compromises, right? I'm saving my powder for when it really matters. I'm saving my, so like you start to rationalize not speaking and not resisting compromise, and you do that year over year over year, and you maybe never meet an occasion where it's actually time to
maybe
spend your powder.
Your family becomes friends with other families, and now your kids' friendships are on the line if you say the wrong thing because your wife can't go to the swimming pool that she likes to go with, and I mean, there's just all sorts of second and third order effects.
Yeah, there's that essay you introduced me to, Santiago, of I can't remember what it's called, but he talks about
Tim O'Brien on the
thinking about courage as sometimes it's tempting to think about it as, I'm saving up my courage, and like when the real thing gets there, that's when I'm going to put it all. That's when I'm going to use it all up and use all my powder. And the reality is, it's something it's a muscle you have to practice using every single day. It's not when you get to that one point, you're just going to be all atrophied and you won't have anything to give.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's this quote. I'll read it. It's pretty short, but he says it's on the Rainy River by Tim O'Brien, and this is the quote: "All of us, I suppose, like to believe that in a moral emergency we will behave like the heroes of our youth, bravely and forthrightly, without thought of personal loss or discredit. Certainly, that was my conviction back in the summer of 1968. If the stakes ever became high enough, if the evil were evil enough." If the good were good enough, I would simply tap a secret reservoir of courage that had been accumulating inside me over the years. Courage, I seem to think, comes to us in finite quantities like an inheritance, and by being frugal and stashing it away and letting it earn interest, we steadily increase our moral capacity in preparation for the day when the account must be drawn down. It was a comforting theory. It dispensed with all those bothersome little acts of daily courage. It offered hope and grace to the repetitive coward. It justified the past while amortizing the future.
Spot on.
It's it lives in my phone because it's
I was about to say that was a fast quote forward.
It's his home screen.
I mean, it should. Yes. Yeah. It absolutely should. So, what's next for SBC for the SBC from here? How do you big victory, getting that amendment pass? How do you protect it? How do you steward it?
Well, the amendment that we passed this year, I said we passed a bright line rule that hopefully will really dispense with this question for good. to the extent you ever can in a institution with sinful humans. But that amendment needs to be ratified at the next meeting of the convention. So we need to get another room of messengers who will vote in at least 2/3 to approve it. So that's in Indianapolis next summer. So American Reformer is going to be continuing to put a spotlight on this issue and a lot of the efforts, and do what we can to help conservatives who are organizing in the convention to make sure that we land that plane. More broadly, I'm very interested. There's a lot of agitation, a lot of new blood coming into the convention who they just want to see the convention leading well in challenging times for any Christian institution. So I'm very interested in seeing how that develops, and these things are related. I hope that there's a groundswell of sort of first-time convention participants who come to Indianapolis next year and are motivated, not just by like fear, wanting to play defense, but like let's encourage, let's push that convention to be an effective servant to all of the, all of evangelicalism, really. I mean, you think, I would love to, imagine a different world with me for a second. Like imagine a world where, a good SBC would be doing things like organizing an underground railroad for parents in California and Minnesota, in Washington, where kids can get trans without their consent. They would be doing aggressive cultural moves. Their Lifeway would be, hopefully like partnering with states in the planting of Christian schools and designing the curriculum for them. The Supreme Court laws now allow state funding to go to religious schools with voucher programs, and like, doing stuff at scale that's going to matter culturally for hundreds of years. Like a project like the resources behind Lifeway. can you imagine how quickly they could stand up and help create Christian schools around the country with curriculum? That's the kind of leadership that we all like earnestly desire to see coming from the convention. And I'm excited because there's a younger crew of guys coming up who are going to start filling those roles. They're going to start pushing that way. I think it's only a matter of time, but we're going to try to hasten it.
That's cool. A lot of it seems like it's just, in many ways, just equipping guys and telling them, like, this is something you can do. Like, if you run Lifeway, if you're the leadership team at Lifeway, did you know that that through the voucher program now state funding can go to private schools? And maybe they just don't know. In many cases, I just see this through Newfoundland, like guys just don't know what they can do. We've seen this in some of the work that we're doing on the venture side, where there are vehicles and opportunities available to certain institutions, and they just don't take advantage of them because they just don't know. The left knows. The left has been taking advantage of things like this for forever. Our guys are focused on faithful building of their business, of their family, and they just need some help to be like, hey, did you know that there are these levels of power?
And there's an idea that there's this inevitable slide left in the larger institutions, and that on both sides, everyone feels like that's happening or has felt that way for a long time. And so to see institutions like the SBC actually reverse some of those things and there be momentum the opposite way makes people think like, oh, things actually can change here. Involvement can actually shift things.
Yeah, absolutely. Conservatives are, we talk about this, conservatives are like very quick to leave institutions and opt out, right? Like I want to remain pure. I'm going to disaffiliate.
Though I saw some Twitter posts when the SBC stuff was going on that was like, why don't they just let it burn?
Because that's what the enemy wants, man. What could make you, if you're the enemy, what would make you happier than destroying like a 13 million person organization that has relative unity? And that's the tragedy. The SBC has been having a lot of turmoil over the last 5 years over various different issues, most of which are distractions. And that's the tragedy, is like these have been times when we really need like good partnership and leadership coming from that institution. It matters. Like you saw that like the New York Times had Washington Post, all the major outlets have reporters on the ground at the convention. if the convention passes a resolution or does this or that, it gets covered. It's a national news story. Like, this is an organization that has the bully pulpit, and at times in the past, that's been used very effectively for good. We've been kind of, I would say, lame and a little bit paralyzed over the last 5 years. We haven't been like a leader on cultural issues because we're fighting all of this internal nonsense. I think coming from compromised and weak leaders, and we need to get back. We need national leadership at the national level to totally get back on the battlefield. I mean, even just on the political situation, you know, like during the Trump administration, right? Whatever your thoughts are about Trump, most of the, 95% of that convention voted for Trump. Most of the leaders said things that totally ensured they would never have a shred of influence with the Trump administration. And so we were essentially, all of our leadership were like off the battlefield, had no influence over the Trump administration because our leaders opted out, even though the majority of our people looked at it with, I think, sober moral calculus and said, hey, Trump's not a saint, but he's clearly like the choice that will be better for this nation and, closer to traditional morality. That wasn't a particularly close question, but our leaders basically disqualified themselves from having any seat at that table. So it's been a challenging time, but we need the SBC back, in politics, effectively.
Well, whenever the convention was 2 weeks ago, it was it's so over, we're so back kind of situation for a moment there.
Yes. 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 The Baptists are coming back, and it's going to be glorious.
Yeah.
So
why did you take this on? Why American Reformer? Why the SBC? You were in elite private equity backgrounds. Why are you fighting for this?
It all started at the 4th of July in 2020. Actually, it did. I had kind of the dream lawyer job, and I had worked in a large elite law firm for a while, and then I went in-house and was enjoying my work. But I felt like the country was falling apart. And it was actually the 4th of July in 2020 when I realized, man, I need to get into impact work soon. I was, that was right after COVID started. I was in suburban Houston, completely locked down. Our cities across our country were burning down. We were all locked down with almost no social interaction. I was grilling steaks by myself with my family in the backyard because, we still weren't allowed to have parties back then. And it's like playing some patriotic songs for my kids and watching them play. And I was listening to Trump's speech on my phone, I think, while I grilled. And I thought to myself, they're never going to feel the pride that I did when I was a kid about being American. When I was younger, I had no doubt. I was blessed to be born in the best country on earth. And we stand for justice on the international stage. Our people are virtuous. We're good. It just struck me that our country has been in the course of being fundamentally transformed. I mean, really for 10 or 15 years. I think it really matters. I think all of us will be judged by our kids and grandkids about what did we do. And so, I was at a point where I felt okay, I'm going to have a roof over my head and food on the table. I don't need to be rich. But I want to improve the patrimony that was given to me for my kids, and so a lot of other people are making that decision now too. It's not just me. I think a lot of folks are feeling the call to that sort of work these days, because I think we're realizing that when the best and brightest are merely toiling long hours to do deals or what have you, and that's all they do, the trajectory, we're just not going to have enough manpower to meaningfully change the trajectory. We need movement at scale. That's what brought me here. So,
that's awesome. I mean, that's pretty cool. you and we've been working together for about a year now, and I've wondered, like, when we're chatting in the office about the SBC or whatever cultural thing, I can't imagine you at, shiny office building having to just shut up and not say any of this stuff. And to your point earlier, like, none of this this conversation won't happen. American Reformer wouldn't be a thing. Like, and yet all of the capacity for that stuff to exist would be there. You would just have to, like, temper.
Yeah. What's that poem, right, about the young kid from the slums dying with all these unwritten masterpieces in his mind, right? Like, that's the tragedy of our brethren who are going to toil their whole careers in mainstream corporations and what have you. Like, they're people that could have been really good soldiers on the field, fighting for the church and for but they're not going to do it because they're going to be captured. So I think I'm hopeful, though, because I just think that there's more that are seeing it this way and are coming over, and a lot more people are, even like from my profession, like lawyers, they're interested in running solo shops or doing anything that's going to give them more independence. This is the battle cry I'm seeing from a lot of folks, is like, we want independence, we want dignity, and be able to, like, hold our heads high and say what we believe. So.
And we have the capacity, opportunity here in New Founding to help a lot of these guys to figure out that transition.
Oh yeah.
So if you're listening to this and you're interested in figuring out ways to get plugged in and know you want to make that jump, DM us on Twitter, talk to us. We're happy to kind of air traffic control you into different ways so you can have impact. Josh, we're running to the end of our time here. So 2 questions as it relates to this topic, your areas of expertise. The black pill question, what's worse than most people realize?
The collapse of complex systems with competence is with competent people retiring is a very serious issue in any complex system in the country. I spent some time in utilities. It's going to happen there. You're probably already seeing it. Longer repair times, crappier infrastructure.
You're telling me women's studies degrees can't help secure the power grid?
There is almost no college degree that can. You know what? Yes. Securing a lot of it is like knowing how to twist a wrench in the field, and having people who do it. And then a lot of it is like having boring, dependable sources of power like coal, instead of like sexy, exotic stuff like wind farms, So, but man, air control, the loss of competence is going to hit pretty hard, I think. But we have complex systems all over the country. I've got friends who work at like Boeing, and like is basically across the board, like this loss of expertise and institutional knowledge is really going to hurt us. The younger workers coming in, I mean, they're several steps behind just right from the start, like in terms of intellectual capacity and drive and work ethic, trustworthiness, all of that. Like, they're not going to get effectively trained before the older generation retires out. Boomers, love them or hate them, but they're kind of holding a lot of stuff together right now. And when they're gone, it's going to be bad.
Again, institutions change at the decay rate, but this one's not going to be a good kind of change.
No. So yeah, that's my, that's, you said one thing that's worse than people realize. That's,
yes.
Okay. That's it.
Okay. But then through the work that you do, MRF, the stuff you saw at the SBC, what's better than most people realize? What's the white pill?
Our kids are going to be running this country.
America!
No. Yeah. I mean, look, I mean, people who've retained virtue, who are giving their kids a good education, just in the classics and great literature, aren't putting their kids in front of screens all day, certainly aren't like allowing them to transition or anything like that. What it was, C.S. Lewis says that, as time goes along, the evil gets worse and the good gets better. And like the good the good in this country with all these like new and rising, communities and churches and just local pockets of virtue. Like there's just exceptional strength and energy in that. And you're even seeing like it's itself a testimony. Like seen people like come to faith because they just realize, partly from the testimony of faithful Christians living together and just exemplifying like the sort of human way of living, the way that God intended us to. And so, yeah, I think things are crazy right now, it's not going to get better just from automatically or by operation of nature. But, the real resistance is like building families, building businesses, churches, and all of that at the local level, and then connecting it at the national level. And there's just there's really good people doing that right now, and gives me a lot of hope for the future.
Yeah, man, that's awesome. Josh, people want to read or follow you, read AMREF, support American Reformer. Where can they go? Where should they do?
Yeah. So you can follow me at Business BYZNESS on Twitter. American Reformers on Twitter at AM Reformer. That's AM Reformer. We have a website, AmericanReformer.org. Please do consider supporting us. We're a baby organization. We want to do a million things. If I had $5 million tomorrow, I would know how to spend every single dollar of that to move the ball forward for the church. And so, always wanting to grow, long wish list. And we have a lot of plans in the works for this year. So we would very much welcome that gift. And you can make that out to American Reformer from our website. We are a 501c3, so your gifts are tax deductible. And but that's where you can find me and all of our friends on the internet. So
nice. Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks, man. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.